Λοιπόν, σας καλωσορίζω όσους ήρθατε στο Ινστιτούτο σήμερα να μας ακούσετε και όσους συμμετέχετε από το μέσο του live streaming. So I'll continue in English since the lectures will be in English and perhaps most of our online audience also might be from abroad. So this is a lecture on in the context of a European Research Council starting grant project led by Dr. Konstantina Kalfa. Okay, it has this unpronounceable name, SMED, whatever, and it's about the middle class housing in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's in the one of the ERC projects we host at the Institute of Mediterranean Studies. So mainly for the sake of our online audience, I will just say very few words about our institute, which is belongs to the largest and most important, perhaps, research foundation in Greece, the FORTH, or Foundation of Research and Technology. And it's the only institute of FORTH that deals with humanities. So the Institute of Mediterranean Studies will have research departments on various aspects of history, like Ottoman history, maritime history, modern history, history of cities, art history, history of theater, and also linguistics and a very active laboratory for geophysical inspection and archaeoenvironment. So we have quite a variety of research directions, and we are proud to take pride in saying that we have a very good success rate with ERC projects, which, as you may know, are the most prestigious and difficult to obtain projects in the European Union. So we have 9 such projects within 9 years, which is quite a score. And one of the last, batch of these projects is the SMED. So I will not be more tiring, so I will call Konstantina will talk a bit about the project, and then we'll have Rowan Ashraf Aly. And because as you will see, this is a multinational project centered on various cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. One of them is Cairo. So this is how we start. So thank you again for being here with us.
Hello everyone. I'm happy to be here. It's the first time I present something on my project in person at the Institute of Mediterranean Studies, so I'm very happy about it. So the project MCHS-MED, How the Middle Class Housed Itself in the Eastern Mediterranean, is based on 2 observations. The first one is that there are striking similarities in many of the cities in the Eastern Mediterranean region, spanning Southern Europe, North Africa, Middle East. And these similarities actually consist on the fact that these cities seem to have been shaped through, at least to a great degree, through the banal repetition of a particular building type, which is the mid-rise apartment building. The second observation is that, in contrast to the archetypical, if you wish, middle-class housing, which is the single-family suburban home, central, as you know, to the American dream, It seems that in the Eastern Mediterranean region, our region, it is rather the apartment building, the apartment living in general, that has been core to the middle class imagination, if you wish. So starting from this observation, which is a material indicator, we want to write the cultural material history of the middle class and of other broader categories, such as the state-citizen relationship, class formation, gender relations, or welfare regimes, or family solidarity, etc. We believe that if we start from these material artifacts, we can unpack broader questions. But then how to do this is a challenging thing, because these cities have been largely unplanned. They were bottom-up, ad hoc products by a host of different actors. So we have developed two core strategies to understand how these cities have been created. The first one is by collecting large amounts of data, geospatial data, such as demolition and building permits. Together with the GeoSat Research Lab, and I'm happy that we have with us the head, Nikos Papadopoulos, we will map the evolution of the apartment building within the city, the spread of the apartment building, also the key actors and their concentration in different parts of the city, the strategies that they use to develop their real estate investments, etc. So in a way, we hope that, and of course, these kind of archives, they were untapped until now. So we hope that by leveraging this kind of data, we are going to have valuable knowledge that there was no accessible before. And then the second strategy is, of course, oral history, and microhistory, and bottom-up history, or field surveys, or on-site observations, etc. That is going to the very one-to-one level. And since these phenomena are bottom-up, there is only one way to unpack them, which is bottom-up history. So oral history is, as you have understood, the theme of our lecture today. And I will just very briefly present the case of Athens as an introduction to the case of Cairo, which is the topic of today's presentation. So in Athens, we've been working together with Despina Valatsou, who I think is watching online today. We've started from this neighborhood, Kalithea, which is today one of the densest neighborhoods, the most densely populated neighborhoods in Athens. And back in the 60s, however, as you can see from these pictures, it was just a low-rise suburb, described as a very pleasant suburb to live in. And yet, within just 15 years, every single two-story houses that you see in this picture was demolished in order for polykatikias to be built on their site through land for flats agreements, etc. So we're trying to find out what caused this rapid transformation and what was, the mechanisms, what were the mechanisms behind this transformation. Of course, again, by using our two strategies, the collection of demolition and building permits. We have done this work with Vasilis Georgakis, who is another partner either in the project, and he's collecting the permits. And of course, the GeoSat lab is going to help us visualize them and map them. And then through oral history, of course. Yeah, and you see this transformation. Actually, this is from the northern part of Kalfa, Harokopu. The pictures you saw before were from the very same site that you are, today looks like this. So you understand that this was a very tragic transformation within just a few period of time. And what I also want to comment here is that in the mid-60s, this suburb was considered a middle-class suburb. It was described as such by architect and planner Konstantinos Doxiadis, a very important figure in planning, who together with his team mapped and analyzed very many neighborhoods in Athens. And about Harokopu, he said, this is a middle-class suburb. And it was described as such by the very residents of Harokopu, who considered themselves as middle class. Now, what is middle class is a big question, but it is important that they self-defined themselves as middle class. And of course, if you see at these houses, because Doxiadis questioned these people, they did a survey there, and they had quite a few amenities for the time, and they were living comfortably, and these were beautiful urban houses, etc. So when these houses were demolished for apartment buildings to be built on their site, of course, as you can imagine, there were incomers that bought the new apartments. This was the new middle class, who were other subjects. They were basically supported by the state because they got loans from the state to buy apartments. And this is why the market went that well, because the state was giving out loans. So we are interested in understanding this transition from the so-called old middle class of Harokopu to the new middle class. What were the differences socially, economically, in terms of self-definition, etc. But the biggest question is, can we map this transition in spatial terms? I mean, can we understand what was the difference between the layouts, like the layout of the old house and the layout of the apartment? These are on the same site. The old house that existed before the polykatikia that was built on the same plot. So what was gained, what was lost is the question. Like probably, as you can imagine, the garden is something that was lost, but quite a few things were also gained, like a modern kitchen with modern amenities, or the balcony, which was considered a status symbol at the time, etc. So in spatial architectural terms, can we understand this transition from an old understanding of the middle class to a new understanding of the middle class that is more inclusive, let's say? And as you know, I don't want to take up too much time here because Rowan is giving the main lecture, but as a closer, I would like to read an excerpt from the oral testimony. The narrator, his father was a police officer, and he got the loan from the state to buy an apartment. So what's how he described his neighbors in the same apartment building, in the polykatikia he lived in. At the time, we were 5 people, my parents and my 2 siblings, and the first to have, sorry, I'm short-sighted, and to move into this polykatikia in 1974 into the 70 square meter apartment. Directly across from us lived Mrs. A from Mykonos. They probably had tourism businesses. Right above on the first floor was KV, unmarried, living with his two unmarried sisters. He was a tax officer. Next door lived GS, who had two daughters, one a physicist, the other working in a government ministry. I mention this to show the kind of people who lived there. Her husband, B, was a mathematician. On the second floor lived KP, a chemistry professor at the who ran at the University of Partara with his wife. Mrs. K, a pharmacist. Also on that floor was S, who ran a travel agency with buses and organized tours. On the third floor lived Z, originally from Lesbos, who also ran tourist businesses. On the fourth floor, in the fourth apartment, lived KA, a commercial shopping captain, and his wife, etc. So. And he ends up saying, I can't remember who stayed there, probably another middle-class family. Everyone in the building was middle class, and relations among neighbors were excellent. So the very fact that he really needs to mention it, the very fact that he even remembers who lived and what occupation they hold in the polykatkia, the apartment building he grew up, and the very fact that he needs to mention to us the environment he grew up in is telling, I believe, we believe of the fact that the apartment building functioned and the apartment housing functioned as a middle class indicator, or as a symbol of middle class status, or in Bourdieu's term, as a marker of middle class distinction. So this is just to show how important apartment building was in the region, and in particular in Athens. As I said, I don't want to continue for longer because we are lucky to have with us Rowan Ashraf Aly. Sorry, I will do an introduction for you. She is an astonishing, outstanding young scholar. We are very lucky to have her in the project. She has already contributed a lot with her creativity and ideas. Rowan holds a Master of Science in Architectural History, Theory and Society from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Bachelor in Architectural Engineering from American University in Cairo. She has received several fellowships and grants for her research, which looks at the intersections of architecture, politics, and environmental injustice in the Middle East and Africa, with a particular focus on contemporary urban transformations and new cities. She has also gained experience beyond academia, working in architecture, urban planning, and research. Now, as she's about to explain, Cairo is a challenging case study because of the fact that we cannot gather permits. It's impossible. She will explain, I believe, the reasons why. And so we have focused on field surveys, and for this work she is aided by Bahir Khaled and Moment Ashraf, who are, again, I believe, together with us online. And they have done an amazing job already. So, Rowan, finally the floor is yours. Here?
Okay, let's try that out. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. I believe you want to be somewhere else, so I'll try to make it up to all of you. And here it is. So, today's lecture, Accessing Memory, Negotiating Challenges and Possibilities of Oral History method in understanding post-World War II Cairo, Cairo's built environment presents an ongoing fieldwork that explores Cairo through oral history with particular focus on middle-class housing. Can you hear me well? Okay. So the starting point of this research is a simple but persistent problem in Cairo. Much of what we know and much of what we want to know about the city and its buildings and its neighborhoods and its everyday life is not easily accessible through formal channels. Like archives are limited and fragmented and difficult to access. And official records often tell only parts of the story. So the question becomes, where is urban knowledge actually located? This project suggests that it's not found only in institutions, but in people, in their memories, their narratives, and their everyday experiences of the city. And at the same time, accessing this knowledge is not straightforward. It requires negotiating questions of trust, access, and social norms. And it requires adapting methods and rethinking assumptions and engaging with the city on its own terms. And in this lecture, I will reflect on both the challenges and the possibilities of using oral history in this context and how these challenges themselves become productive, opening up new ways of understanding Cairo's built environment, not only as a physical space, but as a lived and remembered one. So we begin in Cairo's eastern edge in post-World War II. In the early years, hopefully it works. Okay. So we begin in Cairo's eastern edge, post-World War II. In the early years of the 1950s, in a place not quite a desert nor an urban area, Nasser City emerges in a location that was once something else entirely. It is positioned to the east of Al-Abbasiyya city, an area defined by military barracks, and just south of Heliopolis, which was a suburban enclave of earlier privilege. The district occupies what was for a long time a threshold condition. The land itself, vast, it was approximately 6,540 acres of desert plains, was largely owned by the military. What would become Nasser City was carved out of this terrain through a presidential decree in 1959, establishing the institution of Nasser City in Al-Abbasiyya and granting it full authority over the land and its development. The state project, however, was always larger than what was eventually built, with an overall state vision extending up to 1,200 square kilometers. The initial phase was only a fragment of a much broader ambition for the city. From the outset, Nasser City was imagined as a strategic redirection of Cairo's growth, and its objectives were clear, yet unprecedented. It sought to push urban expansion eastward into the desert and away from the fertile agricultural lands that surrounded the Nile Valley. It aimed to host governmental institutions and large national projects like the Cairo International Stadium, and it promised to provide housing for a rising middle class. And perhaps most significantly, it introduced the idea of making land ownership accessible for the first time through affordable plots. These objectives may sound administrative and even technical, but they signal something deeper. They reflect a moment in Egypt's history where the state actively sought to produce not just housing, but a complete social class, an emerging middle class aligned with the political and economic ideologies of the 1950s and the 1960s. And this is the second zone in the Nasser City, and as you can see from the picture, it imagines this kind of utopian place for the nuclear family to live in. So they were trying to create this family and trying to create this vision through Nasser City. Its construction is inseparable actually from the political project of Gamal Abdel Nasser following the 1952 revolution. Nasser's vision for Egypt was rooted in socialism and Arab nationalism and an explicit break from all the colonial legacies that preceded him. The land on which Nasser City would rise formerly was occupied by British military barracks, and it became a symbolic train. Erasing these barracks and replacing them actually with Nasser City for the middle class was not merely spatial transformation, it was ideological reconstruction. So the city was conceived between 1956 and 1958, and its construction began in the 1960s. It was intended at one point to function almost as an administrative capital within Cairo itself, relocating ministries away from the colonial downtown into a modern, planned environment, yet this ambition remained only partially realized. While some institutions, such as the Ministry of Defense and Al-Azhar University, and these institutions for the government that you see in front of you, they moved to Nasser City, the symbolic center of power, like the parliament, for instance, it remained in downtown Cairo. So this partial relocation reveals something very critical, that Nasser City depended on its connection to the existing capital, even as it attempted to redefine it. At the level of design, the project was aligned with the dominant urban planning ideologies of the time. The architect responsible for the design, Said Quraim, envisioned Nasser City as a city within a city, structured through an orthogonal grid, as you can see, of superblocks in front of you, and each superblock would contain residential units, services, and green spaces, all within walking distance. It was a rational, ordered, and modernist vision, one that promised efficiency and accessibility and a new way of urban living. Even the story of its approval of the new city reflects this kind of dynamic, that Said Quraim himself, his proposal was initially rejected by Gamal Abdel Nasser because it conflicted with the socialist ideals of the time. And it was only revived after a chance encounter with Anwar Sadat, which is the president after Gamal Abdel Nasser, which ultimately led to a presidential order by Nasser himself to kind of build the city. So the city, in this sense, was born not through institutional consensus, but through proximity to power. Yet, if the vision was ambitious, the reality of construction was far less certain. By the mid-1960s, years after its official establishment, Nasser City was still being discussed in the press as a plan rather than a built reality, or at least a complete built reality. Construction was slow and occupancy was very low, and many families were reluctant to move there. And the distance from Cairo's center, combined with the inadequate transportation and the infrastructure, made everyday life difficult in the 60s. And moreover, the absence of low-income housing excluded a very large portion of the population that was most in need to relocate to the city. And this situation even worsened after the 1967 Six Days War. It halted development almost entirely. And economic stagnation, driven by military expenditures and the loss of key national revenues, drastically reduced the pace of construction. Middle-class individuals who had purchased land found themselves unable to build, while others hesitated to invest altogether in the city. And by the early 1970s, Nasser City was far from the utopian suburban image that was meant to be. And large parts of it remained empty, desert landscapes, as you can see. These are the 500 plots to be built. It was like desert landscapes interrupted only by road networks and partially completed buildings. And the city of the revolution existed more of an idea, more than like a lived environment. It was only later on, particularly from the mid-1980s onward, that development accelerated. And this shift was tied to broader economic transformations. With the introduction of al-infitah policies in 1974, the state withdrew from its role as the sole developer in the city, opening the door to private and speculative construction. And buildings began to emerge that did not necessarily adhere to the original plan of the city, driven instead by profit and individual initiatives. So over the time, this produced a very different city. So this is Nasser City before its development, and this is right after. Nasser City expanded both horizontally through state-led developments and vertically through resident-driven modifications. Its population grew far beyond what was planned, from around 200,000 residents to over 700,000 residents. Building regulations were increasingly violated, leading some to argue that Nasser City had effectively become one of Cairo's largest informal areas. not because it lacked planning, but because that planning was no longer followed. And yet, despite these transformations, Nasr City remains, in a way, a middle-class district. So what does it feel like to live there today? If we imagine the city as a scene, as something that we move through rather than simply analyze, it is defined by many contradictions. There is overcrowding, deteriorating infrastructure, and a visible decline in public services. And residents today speak of concerns around safety, education, and healthcare, often turning to expensive private alternatives to compensate for what the state no longer provides. Socially, the cohesive community imagined in the original plan has fragmented. Relationships between neighbors now are weaker, and anxieties around crime and insecurity shape their everyday life. The modernist promise of a self-contained, harmonious urban unit has in many ways unraveled. And yet there is still a sense of prestige attached to Nasr City. Land values have more than doubled, and many residents continue to perceive it as a desirable place to live, particularly in comparison to older or more informal areas of Cairo. This is how Nasr City appears in architectural and urban studies today. Not as a failed project, but as a complex one, a district that began as a carefully planned model for middle-class modernity and evolved into something far more layered. Marked by contradictions and adaptations and ongoing transformations, it is, in many ways, a city that must be read not only through its plans and policies, but through the lived experiences of the community that kind of reshape it. So if Nasr City has been historically planned as a district for the middle class, the question we face today is whether it still is for the middle class, and maybe more importantly, what we actually mean when we say the middle class. Empirically, Nasr City continues to be described as a middle-class district, and according to recent data from Egypt's Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, the area is home to approximately 700,000 residents, the majority of whom fall within what is broadly categorized as the middle class. But these numbers, while useful, they kind of raise a question. What exactly is being measured here? What makes this population in Nasr City a middle-class population? Across social, economic, and urban studies, the middle class is most often defined through quantifiable indicators. Income is the most common measure, either through absolute thresholds or relative positioning within a society. For instance, some global definitions rely on purchasing power parity, which adjusts income levels based on the actual costs of living in different countries. Others use fixed daily incomes thresholds, such as $5 or $10 per day, while some define the middle class as those falling within specific income quintiles or within a percentage range around the median income. For instance, in Nasr City, whether it's middle class is defined through the population in it, or whether through its how many professionals reside in the city, or what's the percentage of purchased units in the city, or the percentage of crowding in the city. So, yet there is no consensus, as scholars note, that there is no universally accepted definition of the middle class, nor a standardized method for measuring it. And some approaches focus on consumption expenditures, what households spend and on what, and others combine income with education, occupation, and access to different services. And in Egypt specifically, much of this data comes from large-scale surveys, such as the Household Income, Expenditure, and Consumption Surveys conducted by CAPMAS, which track spending patterns and housing conditions and household characteristics across the city. And these methods produce a structural image of the middle class. They tell us what people earn, what do they consume, how many rooms they live in, and what kind of jobs they have, but they also flatten so much of the complexity inside the city. Even within these frameworks, the middle class in Egypt is not a neutral category. It is historically and politically very much charged. During the Nasrist period, the middle class was not only a socioeconomic group, but a central component of the state development project, linked to ideals of social justice and linked to education and upward mobility ideals. And over the time, however, this position became increasingly unstable. Economic liberalization and rising inequality, particularly from the 2000s onward, placed growing pressure on the middle-class households, contributing to broader social and political tensions in the city. So when we say that Nasr City is a middle-class district, we are not simply describing an income bracket. We are invoking a layered and contested category. And it is precisely here that the image of the middle class begins to fracture. So as you can see, even Nasr City itself is kind of divided up to sub-districts, and these sub-districts vary across the same characteristics that we have been studying through. Because if we look closely at Nasr City itself, the idea of it as a homogeneous middle-class environment becomes difficult to kind of sustain. Some studies, for instance, identify areas within Nasr City itself as completely informal, like the neighborhood of Al-Sharikat or the 10th neighborhood. These has been classified as informal areas, despite its bland grid and the presence of schools and mosques and banks and governmental buildings. So this complicates the distinction between what is planned and what is informal, and suggesting that these categories can coexist within the same framework and within the city borders. So at a broader scale, this reflects a longer history of urban fragmentation in Cairo. The city has never been socially or spatially unified. From the walled exclusivity of Fatimid Cairo to the elite districts of Khedive al-Cairo and downtown Cairo now, patterns of segregation has been continuously reproduced through the city. So in the 20th century, rapid urbanization and the expansion of informal settlements to the east of older Cairo, where Nasr City started and then afterwards the other developments, within this context, Nasr City occupies an ambiguous position. It was positioned as a planned district for the middle class, more integrated than informal settlements, yet distinct from the elite enclaves on the east of Nasr City. It represents a state-led attempt to produce a specific kind of urban and social order. But over time, it has become part of the same fragmented system it was meant to counter. The middle class in Nasr City does not exist in isolation to the city itself, to Cairo. It coexists with other groups, experiences, and internal differentiations, and it is shaped by processes of decline and adaptation and transformation. Meanwhile, broader urban dynamics, such as the emergence of gated communities, as I said, east to Nasr City, communities in the neoliberal era have drawn wealthier populations away from the districts like Nasr City, further complicating its social composition. So from the outside, Nasr City continues to appear as a middle-class city, but from within, that image becomes very unstable. This leads us to a critical question. If the middle class in Nasr City cannot be clearly bounded and defined, and if it is not fully captured by income or consumption or spatial classifications, then how can it be defined? Or perhaps more importantly, are we asking the wrong question? Instead of trying to fix the middle class as a measurable category, what if we begin to understand it through the lived experience and as a lived experience? Because the existing methods, like the income thresholds and exponential surveys and so on, tells us very little about what it is actually feels like to live as a middle class in a place like Nasr City. They do not capture the sensory and affective dimensions of the everyday life, that sounds that travel through the walls of the apartments itself, the heat that accumulates in the poorly ventilated rooms, or the textures of the furniture and the materials, the ways that light enters a space, or the smells that define the domestic routines of the residents. Two households may fall within the same income bracket, yet inhabit entirely different worlds. This is where our research intervenes. We propose that the middle class in Nasr City cannot be fully understood through quantitative measures alone. Instead, we ask whether it can be reconstructed through the domestic, sensorial experiences of its residents. Through memory, perception, and everyday practices. Methodologically, this means turning to oral history. By engaging with residents' narratives and how they describe their homes, their neighborhoods, and their daily lives, we begin to access a different layer of knowledge. One that does not replace existing definitions, but kind of expands them. one that allows us to move beyond the generic statement that the middle class lives in Nasr City and instead ask, what did it mean at a particular moment in time to live there as the middle class? In this sense, the middle class is no longer just a category to be measured. It becomes something to be experienced, remembered, and interpreted. And it is precisely through this shift from measurement to experience that our methodological approach begins. At this point, our research shifts from the city as a planned object and from the middle class as a defined category, and we move into the field, into the process of actually trying to understand how this category is lived, negotiated, and experienced. And this is where the project became very less certain, because once we decided to approach the middle class through lived experience, the first question we faced was actually very simple. What do we ask? And how do we design a conversation that kind of capture this very layered and unstable thing that is the middle class? We began by constructing a large and at times overwhelming set of questions, as you can see. We started with what might seem like the most straightforward layer, the background of the interviewees. Where are you from? Where were you raised? When did you move to Nasr City? What was your family's economic and educational and professional background? From there, we moved into questions of self-identification. Do they consider themselves part of the middle class? Why or why not? What defines that position in their own understanding of the middle class? But very quickly, we realized something, that these questions alone were not enough. They reproduced the same frameworks we were trying to move beyond. So we shifted the focus, not to the city itself and not to the plan, but to their memories. We asked them to describe Nasr City as they first encountered it. What did it look like? What had they heard about it before moving there? What were the streets and the buildings and the services like? We asked about relationships with the neighborhoods, with the neighbors, about the shops and the places they used to go to the most, and about their daily routines, and how they moved through the city and how they inhabited their own apartments. From there, we moved deeper into the material and spatial history of their homes. Who built the apartments? Who owned it? Who did it sell it to and when? What has changed over time and what has remained? And when did the neighborhood began to shift, and how did this transformation unfold? We also asked about identity in a broader sense. What kind of families lived in Nasr City? And what made them part of a certain class? And how did moving to the city reshape their family structures and gender roles? And finally, we arrived at what became the most important layer of questioning, the sensorial experience. We asked about sounds, what they remember hearing the most. We asked about smells, about light, and about air circulation, and about privacy, and the relationship between the indoor and outdoor spaces, and about the overall ambience of living in Nasr City, and how that feeling changed over time. And at this point, the interviews began to shift. They became less about answers, more about kind of reconstructing their own worlds in the interviews. But even before we could get to these answers, we encountered our first major challenge in this fieldwork, the questions themselves. Not in terms of what the questions asked, but in how they could be asked. Because these questions, as we had formulated them, did not always translate easily into the social and cultural contexts that we were working in. For instance, asking a man directly about his wife's occupation, or asking a woman about the family's financial structures, could be perceived as intrusive and even inappropriate. And asking about gender roles risked implying that there had been changes in the gender roles, and something that could be interpreted as judgment or critique. So even asking about property ownership, who owns what and how, was very sensitive in the context. So the process of questioning had to become very indirect. It had to be negotiated, constantly adapting to, depending on who we are speaking to. A conversation with an older man required a different approach to a conversation with a young woman. Speaking to a civilian was very different from speaking to someone affiliated with the police or the army. And every interview kind of required from us recalibration. And this process, what we asked and what we avoided asking, and how we phrased our questions depending on the interviewee, became in itself a source of knowledge, because it revealed something that would not appear normally in the data sets and the databases, the underlying norms and values and politics and boundaries of being the middle class in this kind of place. So what is considered acceptable to say, what must remain unspoken, and what could be understood without words. In itself, the silence became data for us inside of the interviews. The second challenge we faced was not about questions, but about access. How do you reach the people in this vast city who wants to talk and who could share their knowledge with you? So in Cairo, access is really straightforward. Information, services, and even opportunities often depend on networks. Someone who knows someone who knows someone who could let you in and talk with you. So what has been described as people as infrastructure. So naturally, we began there. We reached out to our friends and our relatives and our acquaintances and asking if they knew residents of Nasr City who lived there for a long time. And this method actually worked to an extent. It allowed us to enter the city, to have conversations that would not be possible with complete strangers, and to access personal histories and spaces. But it also revealed a kind of limitations. Most of the people we could reach through our networks belonged to a similar generation. They were born in the 1990s, or their families had only moved to Nasr City shortly after their birth. The depth of the historical memory that we were looking for was not always there through the personal relationships. And at the same time, we realized that these personal connections were doing something very crucial. They were enabling some sort of trust within the city residents. Because these kind of information that we were asking for and we were looking for about the families and the histories and about the memories, it's not something that people in Cairo readily share with strangers. Residents were very hesitant to reveal where they lived even, and their addresses, and to allow us into their homes or to speak openly about their lives if they felt that they were being observed or studied or researched. So if familiarity created trust, but limited our sample, perhaps anonymity could expand it, and that's what we thought about next. So we turned to social media. There are hundreds of online groups dedicated to Nasr City alone, where these spaces where residents kind of exchange information and advertise properties and share complaints and discuss everyday issues. We posted about our research in these groups, asking for participants, and this in many ways worked. We were able to reach older residents, people who had lived in Nasr City since its earlier decades. Some shared brief memories publicly, while others agreed to longer conversations over the phone or online. And interestingly, these remote conversations often became more detailed than the in-person encounters. The distance kind of created a sense of ease. Interviewees felt less observed and less threatened, and the conversations became more like a casual chat or exchange. But this method also had its own limitations. Women in particular were harder to reach through this online channel. Participation of women depended largely on the approval of their husbands or their family members, and more importantly, this approach kind of removed us from the physical environment that we were trying to study and understand, and we could hear about the places, but we could not see them, and we were missing the spatial and the sensory context. So we tried the third approach. We went into the neighborhoods themselves, not to the homes, but to the shared places, to the local markets, to the small shops, to the mosques, to the coffee shops, places where older residents usually gather and where everyday life kind of unfolds in public. And here something shifted again. These conversations with the people in the public spaces, often happening over a cup of coffee or after a Friday prayer, we were more grounded in the place itself. They allowed us to observe, to listen, to situate the narratives within a physical environment. But trust still remained fragile. People were very cautious. Some feared that we were connected to the recent changes in rent control laws and we were trying to take their homes. Others suspected that we might be affiliated with the police and we were spying with them, some foreign institutions. Agendas, they wanted that somehow we want to harm the country and harm them. And there was like a general hesitation, a sense that sharing information could have consequences. And so even here, access was pretty partial. We could approach, we could talk, but we could not fully enter. We were stopped at the gates. What emerged from these different methods that we tried was not a single seamless fieldwork process, but a kind of a fragmented one, mirroring the very condition of the city itself that we are trying to study. Each approach opened a certain doors and closed others, and each produced a different kind of knowledge. And it is precisely within these fragments that these negotiations and hesitations and partial access that our understanding of the middle class in Nasser City begins to take shape. So these are insights from our interviews. What emerged from this fieldwork that we have been doing was not only a method, but a set of insights about how knowledge is produced and about how Nasser City reveals when approached through lived experience rather than predefined categories. The first set of insights relates to what we might call street politics, the condition under which research itself becomes possible. Very early on, we realized that how we positioned ourselves was not a neutral decision. If we introduced ourselves to the people as people who work or suggested that this is part of a paid project, the research was immediate resistance. The reaction from the people was an immediate resistance. Interviewees became suspicious and sometimes even uncooperative and hostile. There was a reoccurring fear that we might be scamming them or spying or somehow working against their interests or the country. What proved more effective was to present ourselves as researchers conducting a study that we were studying and in need of help. This shift kind of, while it's very subtle change, it changed the entire interaction with the people. It placed the interviewees in a position of support rather than in a position of scrutiny. And what this revealed is that even when studying a historical period, access to the history is mediated by contemporary political sensibilities. So in other words, in order to understand about the past, we had to first navigate the present. The second insight emerged through gender politics. In Cairo's social structure, particularly within the middle class, men often occupy the role of decision-making in matters of housing specifically. Buying an apartment is closely tied to marriage. It's a prerequisite to marry. And family formation. And as a result, men tend to hold more detailed knowledge about the history of buildings and ownerships and the transactions that surrounds it. They were also more willing to engage directly with our questions. But women, on the other hand, especially those identified as housewives, were often more hesitant to participate without the approval of their husbands first. Those who did speak with us tended to fall outside this constraint, even they are younger or unmarried women or older women who are widowed or divorced. And yet women played a crucial role in this research process. They were often the connectors, the ones who facilitated access. A woman like Ines here, this is her, the conversation that we had with her, she shared stories. She shared about how she heard from her in-laws and about Nasser City and how they moved into Nasser City when it's like in the early 60s, and she connected us with them. And similarly as well, another interview that we had, Ibrahim, she was the daughter of a doorman. She was born in Nasser City. She gave birth to her children in Nasser City. So these kind of encounters with women, and she was divorced herself, these encounters with women reveal that while access may be like kind of gendered, knowledge itself circulates through more complex and relational networks. The third insight concerns class politics, and it is directly challenging the conventional definitions of the middle class. Almost all the interviewees that we had identified themselves as the middle class, everyone. Yet, when we consider the standard indicators like income and consumption and occupation, they did not fall within the same category. What was striking, however, that the individuals from very different socioeconomic positions often shared similar memories, similar sensorial experiences of the city. A doorman and a resident in the same building, for example, might have vastly different incomes and social standings, yet they attended the same schools, walked the same streets, frequented the same markets, and inhabited the same environmental conditions. This suggests something important, that the middle class identity, at least in the context of Nasr City, during its earlier decades, may not be fully captured by the economic measures alone. It may also be constituted through shared environments and everyday practices. And in this sense, those who might not qualify as middle class by traditional definitions could still be considered part of it when viewed through the lens of lived experience. And at the same time, this condition does not necessarily hold today. In newer gated communities east of Nasr City, and even in parts of Nasr City now, there is a much stronger emphasis on separation and boundary making, and the overlap that once existed has been gradually reduced inside of the city. So finally, the insights we gathered about Nasr City itself are largely grassroots in nature. They do not come from official records or planning documents, but from repeated narratives, shared anecdotes, and overlapping memories. Through these conversations, which you see parts of, we began to piece together a different kind of history. Which areas were developed first, where the earliest markets and shops were located, who the prominent figures were inside of the city, and how everyday life unfolded across different moments in its history. These are fragments, partial, subjective, and sometimes contradictory, but together they offer something that the existing literature often cannot, a textured and a lived account of the city. And it is precisely through these fragments that Nasr City begins to appear, not only as a planned district or a middle class category, but as a lived and continuously structured experience. That was a lot of them. So to conclude, I want to return where this lecture kind of began, with access. What this project has shown so far is that access is not something that we are given inside of the city, it is something we are continuously negotiating. This fieldwork is still ongoing. We are still searching for people, searching for stories, and for moments of trust between the residents of the city. And trust in this context is not guaranteed at all. It is built slowly and very carefully, and often indirectly, through relationships and through time, and through positioning ourselves as not extractors of information, but as listeners to the memories of the people that they have inside the city. And in doing so, we have also had to read against the grain, to look for knowledge in places that are often overlooked, and to speak with people who are typically dismissed as irrelevant. And yet it is often these individuals who hold the most intimate and continuous knowledge of the city. The cleaning lady, the doorman, the man in the ironing shop who has worked there for decades. These are the people who connect stories and across time. They are in many ways what Jane Jacobs described as the eyes on the streets. Not only watching the city, but quietly kind of archiving it. So the question becomes here, what do we do with these fragments of memories? What do we do with the information that we have from the archives and the information that we have now? What if we began to gather them alongside the limited archival material that we have and the existing research that we do now, and attempt to reconstruct the city through both of them together? What if we map Nasr City not only as it was planned, but as it was lived through that time? Here I am inspired by Kevin Lynch and his work on how people perceive and remember urban environments, but rather than mapping paths and edges and landmarks alone, this project seeks to map experiences and memories and routines and atmospheres of the city as it was built across the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and so on. And through this kind of mapping, to produce a composite understanding of the city that moves beyond categories like the middle class, as if it's a static label or something that is static, and instead we have to ask, what did it actually feel like to live as the middle class resident in Nasr City at a particular time, in a particular home, within a particular set of social and spatial conditions? This ultimately is the contribution of this work, and not to replace existing methods, but to kind of expand them, to suggest that urban history and the study of class within it cannot be fully understood without engaging the lived and the remembered and the sensed. And that sometimes the most valuable knowledge about the city is not found in its plans or its archives, but in the people who continue to live in it, remember it, and quietly carry its histories forwards. Thank you very much for listening to this very long lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you very much, Rowan. It was beautiful, I believe. So I think, if we want to summarize this long and beautiful speech, I would say that, as Rowan put it, we cannot understand the middle class of Nasser city outside of the city itself, or something like that is what you said. So yes, again, this is what we are trying to do in the project. This is a short note for the sake of giving credits to the creators. The guide, the interview guide that Rowan showed at the beginning was created together with Despina Valatsou, who is together with us online. So I just wanted, because I forgot to mention before, that she also was involved in the preparation of the general interview guide that, as Rowan explained, has had to change a lot, especially for the case of Cairo, negotiated, as you said. So please, I would like to invite you to pose any questions if you do have, and we would love you to have questions, because we would love to open up the discussion and get your feedback. So Marinos, I think, is the first one.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. This is the neighborhood near Al-Azhar.
Near what?
Near the University Al-Azhar.
Al-Azhar, yes, exactly.
Okay,
actually, Al-Azhar University was one of the first institutions that was moved to Nasser City when it first started. So the housing beside the Al-Azhar University was one of the very first ones to appear in the city.
So it's not housed in the old buildings?
No, it's near it. So they kind of relocated Al-Azhar University for the girls inside of the new city when it was first developed. So Al-Azhar University is a very, very old university that was in Cairo, but when they first started Nasser City, they removed part of it, the university for the girls, into Nasser City.
Okay. Now my questions are, there are two. One is, I mean, has more of an architectural side.
Yeah.
Like, we also see in this picture now, but it was clear in the video how you have these roofed balconies designed by architects, and how people have been, covering them up with glass panes, or we do this. I mean, this is very common in Greece as well, as we know. But in Greece, this is against the bylaws and perhaps against laws, if I understood correctly the difference between laws and bylaws. I had to Google it. So is this something that is lawful?
No, it's not.
So it's again
no,
the inhabitants' intervention into architecture, and this is this something covered by the project, and especially by your research? So this is one question. The other is, I was wondering, I mean, Egypt has this very large cinema and I suppose also TV industry. Yeah. So can you also trace this this city and the prestige or not prestige of this housing in cinema or television series, as you can in Greece, where you can clearly see in specific movies and also in series how this was a middle class, or advertised as a middle class housing, the new style condominium and so on.
Yeah. So I think for your first question, yes, all the changes that people have been doing to their apartment buildings is completely not lawful. After 1970s, 1974 especially, after the infitah policies of Anwar Sadat, which is the open trade policies, people started in Nasser City building as they wish. So they added extensions to the building heights. So the buildings were supposed to be like 5 floors high. This was the law. So after this time, especially in the 1980s, people started building like a couple of floors. So sometimes like it went up to 9 or 10 floors for each and every apartment. And then afterwards, they kind of talked with the government and tried to make peace with it, but it was completely unlawful. They also took up, so in each apartment plot, so the laws was like you have to leave some like setback for the backyards behind the buildings, so people after the 1980s, they started using up that space as well. And they built in it and they extended their own apartments and they used each and every place that they could get their hands on. And even they used up the spaces of their balconies. So the original plans had balconies, so they covered it up and they closed it up and they used the extra space as an extra room or something. So all of these kind of changes has been happening after the 1980s, after Nasser City became very desirable and very prestigious and very nice place to live. So people started using up each and every space they could get their hands on. So this is for your first question. The second question, yes, we are now trying to trace down Nasser City in all of the literature and the movies, but it's not as common to have Nasser City in the movies and in the literature, but we're trying to do that now. We have like a synopsis from an old movie, and that was like depicting the start of Nasser City itself, but that's what we were working on now to kind of collect this.
Question?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I also have a question about balconies. It's for both of you. In Athens, sorry, because it's also for Konstantina.
Yeah.
In Athens, you have, in the buildings in Polykatikias, you have big balconies, and as you're going up and up, it's starting to be bigger and bigger. And usually it's an open space where the families spend time, and it's very like the flat with a big balcony, it's expensive than the other one, and so on. Here we can see this type of balconies that you can close, actually, and to have more space and so on. Do you think that it's in Athens, is it connected that in Athens we don't have public spaces like gardens, squares, or so on? Do you think that it's in some way how connected to this? Because in other countries like even in ex-Soviet countries, of course, we have huge public spaces where you can go with your family or friends to stay there. It's not necessary to go to a coffee shop. You can stay in a very big square with many facilities. In the Middle East and some in Beirut also, it's not very common because you don't have public spaces as we know, or in the West, in other countries. Do you think that it's connected in some way, or it's just really irrelevant?
I don't know. Should I go there? Because I have something to comment.
Yeah,
so,
come.
yeah. So it's a very interesting question, actually, because there was an article back in the 1970s, I believe, by Karl Patton that discussed the Greek balcony of the Greek polykatikia as an indicator of village culture, and the fact that it actually functioned as a space for socializing with the neighbor and the people down the street. And I believe there is very much a relation to the fact that in Greece in general, there was not a culture of public space and spending time in public space. And balcony actually functioned as a way of socializing, and it also functioned as a status symbol. When people moved this transition that I talked about in the beginning from the one-story house to the third floor, let's say, of an apartment building. And we had this testimony from a lady that we recently conducted, the interview we conducted with, together with Despina, that she described when she was a young girl and they moved from the old one-story house to the third or fourth floor of an apartment building that, or perhaps it was a lower floor, anyway. She described how she felt, and funny story that she gave away some magazines, some journals that she didn't want, like comic books, etc. And she did not go down the street to give it to her friends, the neighbors that they were playing together. And she went from the balcony, like she said, a queen, throwing them away. Yeah, and we have stories like that, like how it felt like to be on the balcony with the family, etc. And of course, other stories that describe the balcony as a negative thing. You know, losing the garden, this is why I said what is lost, what is gained, because losing the garden and having to spend outdoors only in such a small space as the balcony is. I don't know if
in case of
maybe
Cairo,
you can come here.
I think I should close this one. Better. I think in case of Cairo, people like their balconies because it's basically their public space. So closing off their balconies was, I think, merely related to land values and trying to make their apartments wider and bigger. So they really like their balconies, and it has all of this kind of politics around it when women can use the balconies at night because there will not be light and they cannot be seen, or else they have to wear their scarves and so on. So some of the interviews that we had, they bought their apartments especially because of the balcony, because it's wide and because it's big and they want to spend time in the balcony. So I think those who chose to close off their balconies and it's just because they need more space and they're trying to make use of each and every meter in their plots. Yes, please.
The balconies could work like sharp machine in the Ottoman houses. I mean, sharp machine in the Ottoman houses that you just said.
Yeah.
The women sit there, they see the street, but no one see them back.
Yeah.
It might happen the same thing in Egypt as well.
It's called the Mashrabiya. Mashrabiya is the structure that you're talking about, that you can see people on the outside, but you cannot see them in the inside. And the Mashrabiyas, they were strictly in the older parts of Cairo. They were traditional forms of architecture, so they are not used now in the newer architecture. And no, it does not behave in the same way because people can see them in the streets, they can see them back. And that's why I said that women had to choose like specific times. They could go outside on the balcony so people from the outside cannot see them. Or the land values of the apartment building itself kind of drops drastically if there's like an apartment building right close to them. So when they go out in the balcony, they can see the neighbors, or from the windows themselves, they can see each other. So we kind of asked them about this relationship between the indoors and outdoors. What do they use? Do they always like close off their windows, or do they open it up? And the interviews revealed how they kind of relate with this indoor-outdoors relationship.
I have a small question about the consumption of the middle class.
Yeah.
According to the Bourdieu and the School of Sociology, according to the Bourdieu, they think that one of the transformation happened in the middle class and also other class about their pleasure time. When you have cinemas like 1960s, Egyptian cinema was very popular. Yeah. When it's transformed into TV, the use of the space changed. And I want to ask what happens to the parks, cinemas, so on and so forth in this middle class Nasser city.
Yeah, so interestingly in Nasser city, it was the first districts where each block has a garden. This was not the case in older Cairo, but interestingly as well, how people use these gardens has not much changed as well. So you don't see how people use these gardens and these public spaces and these cinemas in the same way people in other countries kind of use them. So I think it would be very interesting to trace how people using these gardens specifically kind of changed over the time, but we still haven't like kind of really studied these public gardens and how the people have been using them changed over the time. So yes. So let's say about anything.
Thank you, Ron. It was a very interesting lecture. I have questions about class and gender. So let me begin with class, and since Akin mentioned already middle class. What about upper class, first of all? I mean, in this district, middle class in many aspects has been, I mean, it is an empty signifier, right? I mean, it's something that it can be filled with meaning, but many times it remains vague. And maybe that's what your problem is with using this term. And there are many very good studies about how, for instance, middle class was initially began to be used as a term in Britain in 1800, because the middle is something that has been associated with quite different meanings in other countries. I mean, in France and in Belgium, it's classe moyenne refers mostly to petite bourgeoisie, right? I think another question is if there is an indigenous term in Egypt that plays the role of the middle class. I mean, is it something that is connected with modernity, middle class? In Greece, there were, in other societies, there were terms that were used, that were indigenous and popular before introducing a vocabulary of class. Okay, so for instance, in Greece, there was a term that referred to the owners of houses, or the boss of the house. So I don't know if in these interviews you contacted, there is a, I don't know, if you question this terminology, how, what everybody used.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Yeah. Actually, everyone we interviewed, as I said in the presentation, everyone identified themselves with the middle class, even those who are the daughter of a doorman or someone who has who's a wealthy person who now owns a couple other apartment buildings all across Cairo, also defines himself as the middle class. So I think that's the problem. But after the 1980s, as I said, after the boom in Nasser City, the upper classes were in Nasser City. All of that was up until the 1990s, when the new gated communities, the new Attamiyya and the golf courts and the gated communities and all of these new developments has been happening on the east of Nasser City. So all these new desert developments kind of attracted the upper classes out of Nasser City, and they moved to these more exclusive, more empty, because now Nasser City is the new middle, the new downtown Cairo, because it connects the older Cairo with the new Cairo. So now it's all occupied and it's very, very busy. And now all the upper classes are moving outside from Nasser City to these new developments to the east. So before they had options, all the upper class were in Nasser City. But now, once they have all of these newer options, they moved outside of the city. And yes, people in Egypt have these terminologies about the upper classes and the middle classes. And actually, now in Egypt, we kind of lost this kind of middle class thing. So we now have people that we call from Egypt in English, and people we call from Masr, which is the Arabic translation of Egypt. So people from Egypt are the upper class, and people from Masr, which is the same word, but these are from the all other classes. So we have these distinctions and these terminologies to kind of describe these people and the other all the time. But we don't have a definition, interestingly, of the middle class, because everyone, when we ask them, they say, yeah, we are from the middle class. Life is good and it's okay. No one ever declares that they are filthy rich, and no one ever declares that they are poor. Everyone is the middle class. But they always have definitions of the other. So these people are from Egypt, and these people are from Masr, but we are all from the middle class. So it's kind of mind-boggling to kind of unravel these distinctions and how people kind of define themselves.
But do relations of production enter into this discussion about what class am I, middle class? I mean, if everybody is middle class, it has to do with income
Yeah.
at the end.
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
I wonder about how should we define middle class, and since the class has been used very much in the Marxist tradition, which puts some emphasis on not on the consumption, on the income, on the how much money one gets. This is something that Americans use very much in order to conduct surveys and gallups and all this. But if we want to put the relations of production at the center of our understanding of a society, I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, how this districts, the habitats of the district are incorporated into broader society. Right?
I think that's the point of what we're trying to figure out with this study is, can we define the middle class through domestic experience, through how they live and through what happens inside of their house and their sensorial experience and what kind of they wake up into and what they get access to and who do they talk to and the relationships with their neighbors and the relationships with the doorman and the relationships outside of their apartment building. So that's, I think, what we are trying to do here is to redefine the middle class through a set of domestic experiences, because living in one of the gated communities in eastern of Nasser City is completely different than living in Nasser City, and it's completely different as well than living in one of the older informal neighborhoods in older Cairo. So that's what we're trying to do. Can we understand the middle class through Can we understand the middle class through people's experience inside of their homes or not?
So, as Rowan said repeatedly in the lecture, we are just adding up to other definitions of the middle class rather than substituting in a way. And in terms of relations of production, don't you think, Nikos, that if we try to think in this way, then the middle class disappears because, you know, in political economy of capitalism, there is no middle class. Middle class is a construction, political construction as well. And this is the way we see it as well, that is more of a self-definition, a self-identification, rather than a real thing. Because it's, and I understand where you're going when you're saying it's such a bad thing, but we are there, we're on the same page here, because we are just trying to add up on how the middle class was also instrumentalized in the politics of the region, was used as, and housing was given the significance that was given as a symbol of distinction, if you wish. So yeah, it's a big discussion. We're still trying to, you know, get into it. But yeah, so the second question, I don't know if you want to.
About gender. So I wonder in these interviews if women and men remember different things. If they mentioned, they understood in different ways the neighborhood, the relations between the neighbors, the living space, the lived space.
Yeah.
I mean, my small experience, starting Carnival in Izmir before 1922, and reading interviews by women and by men, they mentioned very different things. Women remember things that were happening inside the house mostly, and men mostly outside the house. So, or there were different networks of relations between women in the neighborhood. And sometimes men do not have this close relationship with neighbors. I don't know if this is something that you could see in these interviews.
Yeah, Well, in our case, it wasn't much related to how actually the men and women are kind of related inside of the city, but how do we approach them? Because in my team, we have men and I am the woman in the team. So who do we approach was very different. So who do I speak to? And actually one time I went there, so we went on a field work, me and the other researcher, Rowan Ashraf, we went there and then we started talking with people, and he found himself unable to talk with people because I was there with him. So we had to kind of separate part ways so I could speak with people and he could speak with him, and it became much more successful when he went alone, so he could approach the men on the coffee houses. So for instance, in my case, I cannot go to the coffee house and sit there with the men and talk and try to interview people, but he could do that. And on vice versa, he cannot talk with the housewives of the doormen outside of the apartments, but I can talk with them. So yes, these kind of dynamics were existent inside of Cairo, and then we had to navigate them, and thankfully we had the men and we had the women inside of the team, so we each approached those who would give us access to interviewing them. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very stimulating for me presentation, and I'm really very emotionally moved because I'm seeing all these buildings, and I have the impression that I'm in Sofia or in Moscow. I know this kind of buildings. I have lived in something like this. And but my questions is it's maybe it's not this. It's a remark or some comparison with the case of Bulgaria. Two things I want to say related to the middle class. The first one is the creation of this kind of regions with the big buildings with is very well organized by the state, and they was organized for people who don't come from the city. So this kind of buildings was peopled with working class from outside of the cities. So and in fact it was working class, and but who was transformed in the new middle class in the socialist Bulgaria. And in these buildings, we can find as well all, how to say, citizens of the city. But in fact, this is something mixed. The new middle class of the socialist Bulgaria is something between the rural population who came in the city to work, and the old citizens that they continue their life in the city. And my question is if there is some parallel phenomenon in Cairo for the social composition of this unknown middle class. Thank you.
Yeah, in case of Cairo, this change wasn't that intensive because people who had access and people who could actually buy and stay inside of Nasser city, usually not the people who are coming from the rural lands because they cannot afford moving into the city. And especially in the very start of the Nasser city, it was built for the army officers and the police officers. So these people who had access into living inside of the city. So, and the middle class then, they were actually living in the city. They were living in Cairo and they just moved to the other city. So this kind of transition wasn't that intensive. But you could see this transition in the other informal neighborhoods around Cairo. So people who are coming from the delta and people who are coming from the agricultural lands, they usually take over the agricultural land that they're living in and they build in it and they start a whole informal settlement. So this kind of transition that you're talking to into living into the city, which wasn't in the same case before, happens in the informal settlements around Nasser city, not inside Nasser city itself. And maybe we can measure it in the more informal parts of the city itself, because the city has more formal and more informal parts of it. So maybe this transition could be happening more inside of these informal or poorer parts of the city. Yes.
Thank you very much for
You're
this
welcome.
wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I would like to ask a question about, like when I compare with Turkey again. We have like from 70s, 80s, 90s, we have these, like the Polikatiki, this multi-floored, like the apartment complexes. Mostly like the first started as like the middle class, and as you were mentioning, like the army officers, etc. We have like the professors, like the complexes for professors, let's say, for let's say the different, like the state civil servants, etc. And one of the features of these were like the security or fences of these complexes, and it created this kind of a culture, side culture, like this, because your children grows up in, like in such complex, like they are protected from outside, and it was a middle class thing. But in time, it turned into a kind of from middle class, it turned into a much more high class society, and it came to a position that even you own the house, it is monthly, how to say, you have to pay for the security. It's as high as a rent.
Yeah.
So, do you have this fence or security thing in Cairo as well?
Yeah, inside of Nasser city, the only form of security was not in form of fences or gates around the city, but in the form of the doorman, the one person who all the apartment building owners, they kind of share together, and they give him rent each and every month to stay in the ground floor of the apartment building and take care of everything and run errands. And he's like the security guard of the apartment building, so no one goes up and no one goes down without knowing who he is or where he's going to. So this is the form of security that the residents of Nasser city have. But the gates that you're talking about started to appear much earlier in the 1990s in the compounds and the gated communities, and that's why it's gated communities on the east of Nasser city. And these are much, much more exclusive, and they are strictly for the upper classes. So no middle classes could have like a gated complete community that you cannot enter without having an apartment inside as well. For instance, or like you're visiting someone. So yes, the gated communities are existent in Cairo, but not for the middle class, and they appeared much more after the 1960s. It appeared in the 1990s onward.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, everyone, for
you
the
enjoyed
amazing
it.
questions.
Thank you,
Thank
Rowan.
you.